when I was in, I'd guarded nuke missiles in Wyoming, and so we had hours and hours and hours of just time where we were sitting around doing nothing. And so I'd have a laptop out there and try to do some writing here and there, and then I'd kind of get bored and go and do something else.
Drop troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Reaction in the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Untold stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
All right, welcome to the podcast. Today we are talking, this is a request from the Discord, so thank you very much for that. We're talking
And don't
about,
blame us if it goes wrong.
I know, if it goes awry, don't blame us. We're talking about how we transitioned from the military to writing military science fiction. And I think for a lot of us, when we first started talking about this is like, well, we went into the military still as writers. Josh, I don't know that we've talked about it specifically, but I think it was the transition to writing MILSF through that. But Josh, I'll put you on the spot since I haven't heard your answer. Do you want to talk about
Ooh,
where you started writing and
nice.
how you transferred, how that fit into the military, or afterwards?
I started writing before I joined. I wrote my first completed story when I was 14. And I think maybe my story is kind of similar to a lot of other writers is I wrote and then didn't write and then picked it back up a year or so later and then didn't write. And I did that for a number of years, always kind of dabbled with it. When I was in the military, I wrote off and on. I'd get an idea and I'd want to write it. And when I was in, I'd guarded nuke missiles in Wyoming. And so we had hours and hours and hours of just time where we were sitting around doing nothing. And so I'd have a laptop out there and try to do some writing here and there. And then I'd kind of get bored and go and do something else. And that happened a lot. My entire career, actually, in the military, that happened. I'd write a little bit and then stop, and then write a little bit and then stop. And I didn't actually start writing kind of as a uh thing, like an actual thing, until I got out. And it was several years after I joined the police department. Um, uh, I I want to say it was in 2010 or 2011 when I was like, all right, I'm actually going to do this and sit down and write. And then it took off from there. Like I didn't have those times where I would stop. It became a thing. But uh, so I didn't trans it didn't go military and then I became a writer. Was military and then I was a cop and then I worked for a cop for a long time and then I was a part-time writer for while I was a cop, and that transitioned into full-time writing from there. But I always, like, while I was in the military, I read predominantly mill sci-fi. I read a lot of David Weber when I was in. I can't remember. There was a story I read by Tim Zahn, and I think it was called Angel Mass. Um, I'd have to look it up to see if that was, but I remember reading that and thinking that was amazing.
And now you
Uh,
published him on.
yeah, yeah, it's a great guy.
Did you read his
He's
Cobra's novel when you were in the military?
No, actually, the only thing non-Star Wars that I've read by Tim is the Icarus Hunt and the Icarus Plot, I think is what those two books are called. And then I've read his uh oh, I just had it in my head and I thought of the Icarus thing and I lost it.
How did
Oh, the David Weber Thomas Pope, uh
Prequel?
yeah, the Manticore Ascendant series, the three or four books in that series, he had a hand in. Tom Pope wrote the majority of the actual book, but Tim and David were both in on some of the writing and then the plotting and everything. So I read those.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, no, my transition from work to full-time writer happened after the military and after I had been a cop for almost 10 years. So 10 years after the military.
Did you talk to people about writing while you were in, you know, either on the force or while you were in, like if your buddies saw you writing, did they clown you about it or?
No, I kept it well, not so much on the down low. I just didn't talk about it when I was in the military. And then when I started doing it in the PD, one of my friends, Scott Moon, he writes Mill Sci-Fi as well. He was on the police department and we kind of I don't know, it was kind of random how we met. And then
Who
we
is
talked
this?
about it and
Who is
then
this Scott Moon person? That name sounds fake.
Right.
yeah, yeah. It's the coolest pen name that's not a pen name ever. Uh but we met, and then obviously people in the police department learned kind of through the grapevine that we were writers, and then other officers would buy our books and read them. So everybody knew that I wrote, and were very supportive of that. And then when I left, everybody was extremely supportive of it. So it was really, really cool
Everybody was happy to see you
situation.
go.
Yeah, yeah, that was probably more cause of their excitement than anything.
Yeah, I asked the question
So
just because when I worked for the police department, I felt like people didn't know what to do with it. You know, they'd kind of clown me about it a little bit, ask questions about it, or, hey, writer guy. But they're like, yeah, go buy the books and talk to me about it. Oh, you could actually buy it? Like, yes, here, Google that. And but maybe that was just the culture of our department a little bit.
Yeah, no, I know that some people have kind of dealt with that wherever they're either from their family or from their where they work at and go, you're a writer or whatever else. My experience was always very supportive and very encouraging. Um uh Even to the point where people would, they always come up and say, "Hey, how do you do this?" or "How do you write a book?" or whatever. But I talked to several people that actually took the advice to well and
Mhm.
wrote books themselves. And it was fun. Now, don't ever consider myself a subject matter expert, but it was cool that, you know, people would listen and kind of carry on and do their own thing and kind of have a hand in encouraging somebody else to do something they want to do.
Mhm.
can't count the number of people who've come up to me and said, "Oh, I have all these ideas for a book, but I just can't get started." Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be you could just say, look up NaNoWriMo. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Sit
Uh,
down and write.
yeah, look up NaNoWriMo and then go have an AI write your book for you.
It's interesting the amount of people that you talk to and they learn you're a writer in whatever circumstance you're in, and they're like, "Oh, I could never write a book. I've got an idea, but I could never write it. I don't have the attention span for that," or whatever the excuse is. I can never do that. And I actually remember having those thoughts kind of going on off and on throughout my time in the military. I'd start and I'd write for several weeks and then I'd be done, and just in the back of my mind think I know I kind of want to do this. Like I feel compelled almost to write these words, and then I get so far into it and go, maybe I'm just not cut out for this or something like that. And it wasn't until I just told myself you're going to finish after finishing that first book, then I realized that I could do it, and it was actually a legitimate thing and not just kind of a pipe dream.
I always tell people that the first book's the hardest book you're ever going to write because
Yeah.
Hmm.
that's the book where you learn how you write a book. Because nobody can tell you how you write a book. They can tell you how to write a book, but they can't tell you how you write a book.
Right.
And so yeah, that first book is really a challenge. But once you get that figured out, it gets harder.
So Jeff, what
Yeah,
did
and I wonder
you?
if that
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, I wonder if that kind of translates into the everybody the old traditional model of becoming an author was you write short stories and sell them to magazines and all of that, and then
Yeah.
kind of work your way
Yeah.
up into publishing. And it's not really a thing anymore. But I wonder if the general rule of that finishing the short, even if you're not planning to sell it, I mean that's part of the process is finishing the story and knowing that you can do it and finishing that shorter work. could probably be more encouraging to you and learning more about the process than struggling to write a novel on your first bit, even if
I was
they
I was always the opposite. I hated writing short stories. It was really hard for me to write them, and
yeah,
I was trying to get into writing about the time when that was the way to do it. You know, to get short stories published in like Analog or Asimov's,
right.
and whew, it was really hard writing short stories.
Well, it's such a difference.
Yeah, I'm not good at it.
Harder getting them sold, but
Mm.
I'm not good at it because I write long, and so my
yeah.
10,000 word short stories quickly turn into like 15, 16,000 word short stories very easily.
I feel
Then
like
I
short stories should have a purpose other than just like because I grew up reading like The Lottery and the iRobot anthologies and each one of those short stories had like this really deep meaning. They weren't just I came out of the building and I shot a bunch of people kind of action adventure short stories. And so I always felt like when people were talking about writing short stories, I'm like, well, I mean, like that's great and all, but you could be writing a book unless you have some profound thing to say, like The Lottery did, or I don't know any of the other dozens of short stories that are in republished in books over and over again for people to read. Otherwise, it's like the Aliens anthology we did recently. It was fun, but I approached it more as will this be a new book series for me kind of thing um and I approached it that way as opposed to this is just a short story because to me short stories should have a purpose and that purpose is either it's going to do something for me in my career wise or it's a waste of time and that's why I don't do
well,
anthologies.
yeah, coming from you, I understand that just because you're already established, right? But if you're a brand new author trying to figure out how to actually complete a story rather than writing a 80,000 word novel, completing the story at 10,000 words could be significantly easier and less of a challenge. And I use short stories when I first started as kind of a way to mess around with like plot structure or even just kind of endings because I think you can do a lot cooler things with endings and short stories sometimes than you can with novels just because I don't like to do this often, but I've done endings and short stories where you have like an ambiguous ending, kind of like Inception, or you have a twist ending that just ends at the twist because it's cool and it's a fun thing and you don't have to have the closure or the the, the whole
Well,
structure of the ending of a
maybe I've
novel.
written ambiguous endings, and maybe I haven't.
Yeah, zing.
That was
I
coming.
wrote a show. One of the exercises I did in the short story is writing it backwards, kind of like a Memento. Do you guys remember that movie?
Mhm.
Where everything was it was shot backwards, but also reverse. And so I did that with a short story where I started it at the ending and then worked forward to the beginning, which was the end, and kind of made the reader think that it was just this big, huge, like really cool event, and it ended up the dude just stole a watch and he was getting chased by the cops.
I I have a
It
hard
was
time remembering that movie. I usually have to write things down. So,
you're on a roll today, man.
well, James, you're the host, so you're probably going to be the last one to tell us your story if we don't make you. So, how did you get into writing
Oh, okay.
military
Okay.
science fiction after being in the military?
Yeah, well, I didn't write for a long time after I got out of the army, actually. Like I had written before. In fact, I've got a journalism degree and wrote for a couple different newspapers. Um, and so I could say that I had earned money, writing. But I had an art, like I enlisted to pay for college, and then I had an ROTC scholarship to go to school. And so that just kind of became my focus because it was always a balance that you just couldn't make money writing. Even as a reporter, like I had a lot of friends that continued trying to play that game, working your way up through newspapers. And then the newspaper crash happened, or one of the first ones happened in 2000. And so even friends at newspapers and magazines, like, I have one of the credits I don't talk about that much is like I published an article in Cosmopolitan way back in the day. But
Amazing.
I know. Like but again, that's another thing we talked about. I can't remember which was it the last podcast we talked about connections and networking, right? I got that. I
Mm.
had that and I got paid very well for it because I met one of the editors at Cosmopolitan and they wanted a male perspective on something. So boom. Um, but yeah, I didn't write for a long time. And I actually, after I got out, I was focused on trying to start a business. So I spent about 5 years trying to run a distillery here in Oregon and learned a lot of hard lessons about trying to compete with, Jack Daniels and Maker's Mark and stuff like that. We hit a point with that where I was about $50,000 in debt. I mean, which is nothing for a business, but I still just couldn't be in debt anymore. Um, and so I decided I was going to stop doing that. And I needed something to do that wasn't going to cost me money that I could enjoy doing and got my headspace out of, I failed at this and I'd like to do something I can finish and be successful at. And that's what started me back into writing. And I joined a local writers group. And the thing was, I ran into the writers group was very much focused on that same model that we've been talking about, like write short stories, sell them, work your way up from there. And this was about 2016 or maybe 2015 timeframe. And I was just looking around for different, like, I don't have a lot of time. I would like to publish, I don't like the way a lot of editors are gatekeepers. And I get that. That's fine for what they do. But I've really learned that, you can go straight to the audience and you can get feedback directly from the audience. You can hear what people like and don't like and get people to invest in you rather than having that filter between you and the audience, which is kind of what that process, inserts there. And maybe there's kind of a pick me about it, like, oh, I got selected by this, which is fine. But I just wanted to do something different. And so that's what got me into going more of the independent route. I started again networking, meeting more people, and turned out that a lot of people like to read military science fiction. And when I was writing, that's what I was drawn toward because that's what my experience was. And it's even funny because in the writers groups I've been in, like they just don't they just don't get it a lot of times. Like it's just felt so, I don't say like comfortable, but when you talk to like somebody who reads and enjoys military science fiction, has been in the military, knows what like you don't have to define NCO. Like you could define it if you want to as part of the story, but when you say NCO, when you say officer, you say platoon leader, platoon sergeant for me, that's like I don't have to explain that. I just go right into the story. And I've gotten feedback where people were like, I don't understand why this sergeant is talking to this lieutenant. Like, is this a romantic relationship? I'm like, no. you know and so that's really like when it came to, okay, what do I feel comfortable with, that's really what led me back to military science fiction. And then I started doing more, kind of trying to get my foundation more squared away and reading. Like I didn't realize a lot of the stuff that I was reading as a kid was MILSF. It just wasn't kind of defined that way. And so that's really what has led me back to it, is that's where my experience ended up being, and um when I left, it's funny, when you leave the army, I think a lot of times it felt like getting out of prison. But I always say this, like I really wish the military sometimes would let you take a sabbatical because I would have been, I don't know. I just would have been fine with a break and then probably going back because I joined the army when I was 17. So it was like I hadn't known anything different than
I
that.
mean, technically, you can once your contract is up, you could get out and then go back in
Yeah.
later if you wanted.
Well, I told you guys this story? Like I tried to join the National Guard in 2011, and that's when I had to go through MEPS. I had to lose like 50 pounds. It was ridiculous. I'm 33, 32 years old going through MEPS with 18-year-olds having to do the duck walk and everything. Um, but that's where they told me I had hearing loss, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't have hearing loss. That's why my
You're
wife
like, what?
thinks I'm ignoring her
Say
all
it
the
again.
time. Yeah, but basically I couldn't get a waiver for it. So I was like, oh, well, I guess that door's closed now. But
Yeah.
yeah, so but anyway, that's what led me back to it, and I've felt really fortunate with the community that's here, and it the more I learn about it, just the more interesting it is to me, and even as we talk about military science fiction and different experiences people had in, because I joined at the end of the Cold War. We had guys that had gone through Gulf War One, Bosnia, and then I came in right into, Iraqi freedom, global war on terrorism, and then even that changed as it progressed. So you talk about guys now that technically we could wear the same ribbon, but we have very different experiences about what happened during those times. And so I find
For
that
sure.
stuff really interesting, and when you connect with an audience that understands it, there's just nothing like that. I really like that. So yeah, that's kind of what led me back to it. It's kind of like what Josh just said. Like it feels like a thing sometimes that you can't help not do. But one of the reasons
Yeah.
I even have the pen name I do with James S. Aaron was I worked at a police department for 9 years, and I had to go through a background check for that. And one of the ways to explain, I couldn't, they were really touchy about uh are you doing something that would reflect poorly on the department? And so I had to disclose like everything about the distillery. They were concerned that I was an alcoholic. And then they were,
It's because you
yeah,
owned a distillery.
right. Well, I had to explain that like it's much less like if I lose my license, those are ways that you could lose your livelihood. I was also closing the business, but then having a pen name and those kind of things, like so my pen name is like not a very good pen name as far as like hiding who I am. But that was a kind of a thing I had to think about there because I wanted them to, okay, no, I have this thing that's separate of my so-called professional life. But I don't know. That's why I asked about that. Like, because a lot of times it seems like the other officers didn't really know what to do with it. um, but I did read, I won't say in the Army, I read a lot and my soldiers read a lot. And that was one of the things that I also appreciated like when I came back to it was, you know, we were reading all the time. Like you spend so much time sitting around doing nothing, and you couldn't have. I mean, we didn't have phones at the time, but even then, when you could have phones, you couldn't have your phone in certain places, so you could pull out a paperback and read. And that was a thing you could do. So, so yeah, that's kind of what brought me back to
Cargo
it.
pockets were paperback holders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Except they wouldn't let you. Well, only when you're deployed. Otherwise, you couldn't put anything in your cargo pocket.
I could.
You were an officer. You could do whatever you wanted.
I
I
mean,
could.
our men could too. In the infantry, everybody had stuff in their cargo pockets around the field.
Even in
Yeah, my
garrison, I mean, yeah, in the
experiences
field,
were
but
always that the infantry units were way cooler than the other units. Infantry units are always much better than.
I mean, I don't know about. I don't think you could. They probably would rather you not have anything in there when you're in garrison, but you don't need one in garrison. I mean,
oh, you still
when you're
sit
on the
around doing
field,
nothing.
your cargo pockets are stuffed. You have MREs and crap in your cargo pockets.
I had I don't know if you guys had the Gore-Tex, but I had Gore-Tex
Not in
in
Hawaii.
that pocket right here. Always had a book in that pocket.
Yep. I love the Gore-Tex. In fact, I saw
They
a
didn't.
guy
They
wearing a
didn't
coat.
issue us any Gore-Tex in Hawaii.
You guys are missing out. Like it was, I thought it was the Gore-Tex from a distance, and I got up close, and it was like some fashion statement based on the Gore-Tex, and I was like, that's too bad.
There was a couple of years ago, the old jackets came into style, and everybody was making a version of them, the M60 jackets.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I wanted to get one so bad because those were great jackets.
You can get civilian jackets made of Gore-Tex now.
Well, no, I meant the regular M60.
No, I'm talking about. I was talking to James.
Oh yeah.
No, it's not.
But they like Sitka jackets are made out of Gore-Tex. Are expensive as heck.
I mean, I was in Alaska, which is why we were issued Gore-Tex.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just never gave it back.
I wish I'd done that.
You know what I did as an officer? I was responsible for giving back everything I was issued. So I just went out to I think it was the store on base and just bought my own set of, web gear and everything. And I left the issue stuff in the plastic in the back of my closet and just wore my own
Moneybags
stuff.
over here.
Yeah, I know, right? I was like, I wish I thought of that. Oh, I did. I just didn't have the money. Ended up paying $1,500.
I just didn't want to have to like try to account for it when I got out, and having to go rush around and buy stuff when I'm going to get, sent home from Hawaii. I'm like, I'll just put this in the closet and have it all together in a duffel bag when it's time to turn it in.
I did have a roommate who had of BDUs that were perfectly ironed and absolutely 100% perfect, and a pair of boots that he only ever wore for inspection. And I always thought that was high speed. Unlike me, who was just like, oh, well, this is clean.
Shake it out. It's good. We had some tents burned down in a fire. And so I basically made the soldiers do a complete, oh shoot, what was the type of the investigation? Something -6, 5-6. I don't know. We basically wrote off all of their stuff so they could get new stuff, even though they hadn't necessarily lost it. And it got them all. That way they had extra stuff you know, in the event that happened. My first sergeant was like, "Oh yeah, we're writing all that off right off the tent." Stupid World War II tent with a like wood stove that the whole things were just fire traps, and I don't know, they burned down. But Rick, did you talk about your experience?
Well, I've been writing since I was a little kid, and before I went in the military, when I was in college, um, actually high school, I think I started reading what is now considered military science fiction, although at the time I don't believe they had that subgenre as a thing. But I read Jerry Pournelle, and, and Larry Niven's stuff, and Pournelle wrote a lot of what would now be called at MILSF with the John Christian Falkenberg novels, who's like a mercenary. And then he and Larry Niven wrote the Mote in God's Eye, which is a kind of military science fiction, and a sequel, The Gripping Hand. I forget when the Gripping Hand came out. It might have been after I was in the military, but The Mote in God's Eye came out before.
That's sort of military science fiction. It is solid military sci-fi.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's also got a lot of like political stuff and intrigue in it too. So I was reading it then, and I was writing not necessarily military science fiction, but when I went into ROTC in college, I had a friend who was a enlisted Marine who had been sent to college by the Marines, and he was taking our ROTC classes. And we were in our military history class together, and he and I were talking about how to set up a future world government for a book. So I took what we talked about, and I started writing about my senior year in college, the book that would become Duty on Our Planet. And so I wrote military science fiction technically before I was in the active military. Although I was in the Guard at the time, but I wasn't in the active military yet when I started writing my first military science fiction novel. So being in the military only helped that, since I had already felt the urge to write in that subgenre. So it gave me the clue to like keep my eyes open for things I could put in books later.
What kind of things were you looking for to put in books later?
Oh, like just how people acted, and I had an idea of how like people acted in the National Guard infantry, but I figured even then that wasn't going to be this. I mean, back then it was not the same as people acted in active duty. Things changed after the war on terror started, but back then the National Guard was kind of much more loosey-goosey about lots of things, like how enlisted men and NCOs acted around officers, because in the National Guard, basically you're all civilians who are doing this part-time. So you had people who were, junior NCOs who were cops with like 20 years of experience.
Right.
And then you have an officer who was just a college kid, who just out of college. So people tended to treat each other more back then as what they were on the outside, more than what they were, in the Guard. Now that's changed because the Guard gets activated a lot and they get sent overseas, and you have to have the same kind of military discipline you do for an active duty unit. But back then it was not the case, and there was much, much more lax discipline. So I wanted to get an idea when I went in, like I knew that this wasn't how things were going to be in a real active duty unit. So I wanted to find out, how people acted, how they treated each other, how they dealt with having to be respectful to somebody they didn't really respect, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a big one. Ideas about that kind of stuff, and those are all things that people don't, unless you've been in that situation, you're just not going to understand. or at least that's our job to help them understand, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's honestly one of my favorite types of when you meet somebody enlisted. You know, I got a friend who it was the weirdest thing actually. Like he had a picture of him, like he was in, I can't remember which unit he was in, but they were part of ROTC Op 4. And when I was in ROTC at Fort Lewis Advanced Camp, we were getting smoked by whatever cadre. And so when I went on active duty as a lieutenant, he showed me this picture because he recognized me of me getting smoked doing flutter kicks, and he was leading the flutter kicks. And this guy was like such a character. But he was one of those guys that he had done a bunch of different things, was like an operator of a whole bunch of different kinds of equipment. And when we deployed, he could get anything from anybody. Like he was just really good at going to the Air Force, the Navy. Like, we don't have air conditioners. Oh, guess what? Schmidt found air conditioners. You know, we don't have good food. Guess what? Schmidt found,
The
fresh apples.
scrounger.
He was so good at it. Yeah. Like here comes Schmidt in a forklift. Like, where do you get that? Who knows? Who cares? And he became a warrant officer, and I think he did just retire recently as like a CW3. So he became a unicorn. But watching that guy like just advance through the ranks was one of the really gratifying things about the time I was in. I love that stuff. All right, Jeff, I think you have not told your story.
Well, mine's kind of interesting.
We'll be the judge of
I
that.
joined the Army because of military sci-fi. I
Okay.
read, and not just military sci-fi, but military fiction in general. I read a lot as a kid. I mean,
You drank the Kool-Aid.
I have what you call an interesting childhood, and my way of surviving through that childhood was reading just a lot. And so, and not only did I read like all the Star Trek books and all the Star Wars books, but I read all the Tom Clancy novels and all the obviously this is before David, but I read all the classic Hammer and Slammers and Starship Troopers and Starship Troopers particularly was probably why I joined the Army. Mobile infantry is what made me the man I am today. And Ender's Game and things like that. So when I got out of the Army, and I'd always written like little things here and there, but because of my dyslexia that I didn't know about, I just thought I was a terrible writer, and so I just wrote for me. I didn't worry about what anybody thought about it because I never showed to anybody, because if I did, they hated it and said, "Oh, you're terrible." So when I got out, I didn't really write much. Concentrated a lot on it. I did other things. And, because of my ADHD, I was always kind of bouncing around from job to job. I know this in retrospect. One of the hallmarks of ADHD is people who tend to work really hard and really well for a year or two at a job, and they excel at it. And then when they're not promoted, they quit. And that I read that recently, and I was like, wow, that's like the story of my life. And so it wasn't until like 2011 that I started writing again seriously. And I have, obviously, since I was a kid, reading military sci-fi, military fiction, it's what I always wanted to write, but I knew I wasn't very good. And so I wrote other things. But this time when I started writing, it was different. It was me wanting to succeed at something when I hadn't really succeeded at anything in my life. And it was kind of one of those like, I'm not going to fail one more time kind of deals. And so I started writing 5-6 hours a day and focused really hard on it, and making sure everything I wrote was with a purpose, getting better, learning more stuff. And if I didn't know how to do something, I'd read a book about it. And what's really interesting is when I started writing, I was like, I'm not good enough to write military sci-fi. I love military sci-fi, but to me, military sci-fi is Robert Heinlein, it's Orson Scott Card, it's David Weber. You don't write Saturday morning cartoons and then put yourself in the same genre as those guys. You've got to be better than average. I had to be better than I was. And so I wrote superheroes and I wrote urban fantasy.
Oh, we lost him.
Jeff is frozen. He's frozen in carbonite.
What I felt like was good enough.
We
We
lost
lost
you
you
for a
for
second.
about like 15 seconds there, bro.
You were talking about what you'd written previously.
Yeah, and so
All
I
the
was
things you wrote.
it was all written with the purpose of getting to the place where I was good enough to write and be on the same shelf as those guys, at least, and without being embarrassed about it. Like if my first book I published had been put on a shelf next to Robert Heinlein, and I would have been ashamed. Been like, no, no. But then I started writing really focusing on military sci-fi after my superhero series were successful, and Grimm's Award kind of blew up and did really, really well. It still does, and that's kind of where that came from. But the Army was something that was always going to happen for me. I was always going to join the military growing up. That was my plan. Not being in the military until I retired ended up being not the plan. I mean, I had planned on being in the military until I retired, and then not being able to finish was kind of derailed my life a little bit. But I got where I needed to be.
I always felt like, in terms of writing in the genre, I kind of like Jeff, where I read both science fiction and like Tom Clancy, for instance. I just ate up those books and absolutely loved them. And I think a combination of two factors pushed me into mil sci-fi. One, I liked military and I liked science fiction, so it kind of like blended together almost by default. But also, and I'm not sure when I say this, I don't mean it as a cop out, and I don't mean to say that military science fiction is the lesser of the two. But I also wanted to write realistic military fiction, but I didn't want to get anything wrong. And I was terrified of getting things wrong. And so, in my mind, some of the bonus of writing mil sci-fi was it didn't matter because I was making it up anyway. I couldn't get it wrong because I was making it up.
And yet
And
people will still
so,
tell you get it wrong.
right, exactly. And it's just one of those things where you can, it's a, I don't necessarily say it's a small niche genre, but it is a niche genre, that has a very dedicated following. And if you can do it well, then you're going to succeed in the genre. Um, and I think that, uh, as far as niche genres go, it's probably the biggest,
Is it
right?
more
Like
niche
in
than the
terms
Coast
of,
Guard?
well, I mean, like you talk about like weird westerns. Like there's a lot of people that like weird westerns, but that niche genre, the reader audience
You
is
say a
very
lot,
small.
but you mean like 10.
Yeah. Um,
I like weird westerns.
I do too.
Just
I
got to
love them.
find the people.
But the audience isn't there.
Yeah.
But there's a mil sci-fi kind of falls into a weird thing where you can, if you're looking for mil sci-fi, you're going to get it. But if you're looking for and not necessarily mil sci-fi, you still might like it. I think even people that read regular military fiction would find something to like about mil sci-fi in most cases. So it is kind of a cool niche genre, but it kind of has its place in multiple classifications.
We actually really were lucked out too, because like we're coming to the end of a 23 or 24-year period of people who entire generations that were in the military, and now they're coming out, and they, like us, there are things about the Army and the military in general that you miss when you're a civilian. There's obviously things you don't miss, but one of the things you
Right.
miss is that sense of purpose and camaraderie.
Yeah.
And we write about that, and that's enjoyable.
I think there's also a strong feeling of, and this is a thing that always like that I love. I mean, I love about the Army, like most, or the military, I should say, is like most people join because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to do something that is important. They would like to maybe not change the world, but just be part of something that's going to do something, right? And not to get too much, I feel like this is a pretty common sentiment among veterans, but we did what our country asked us to do, and our country sent us to do some things that were pretty rough, and not people aren't happy about that at this point. Um, and the way those things turned out. And military science fiction gives you an opportunity to kind of take those same sentiments and put it in you know, just a better situation. Like you can feel better about what you did, what they did, those characters did. You have time to explain or be there with the character, why they're making the decisions they make. You know, when you're in a situation where all you're doing is, being a mushroom, stuck in the dark and fed crap, like you don't know what the general's thinking. You don't know what what command is thinking or fleet is thinking or why they're doing the things they do. And military science fiction can give you the opportunity to kind of look at that from all levels and also do it in a way that is you can feel better about, a story that you can um I don't know, feel good about, I guess, is just something I
Well,
think.
You get to
yeah,
explore
like
like
you
different
can connect
aspects of the
to it.
Yeah.
system.
Yeah, no, you can explore those things, and it's kind of cathartic in a way where you can kind of explore it and kind of go down a rabbit hole that you might not necessarily want to go into in your, real life. But also I found too that, and this is a small experience, but I found too that um, some of my fiction has allowed other people to deal with their own, I don't want to say trauma, but experiences, maybe negative experiences that they had in the military, that they were able to kind of see in either some of the characters that I had or some of the plot elements that I had, and the way that I either dealt with the situation or the way the character handled it or whatever it is, help that reader kind of deal with their own real life situation, maybe in just trying to understand it or cope with it or whatever. And you can do that in mil sci-fi without touching reality. Like you don't have to, I'm not saying like all veterans deal with this, but sometimes, if you spent 20 years in a combat situation in Afghanistan, you might not want to read a military story about Afghanistan. Like that might be too close to home. And so you can deal with similar experiences and similar events somewhere else on a different planet, and it's not going to be that close to be in danger of triggering some kind of real emotional negative response to that.
No, I've gotten emails from readers who are like, who that's exactly what it was. Is it was like, I'd be lying if I said writing these books wasn't therapeutic for me too, dealing with some of
Yeah, for sure.
my own trauma, despite the fact that I wasn't really, you know, in the combat arena like you guys, some of you guys were. But the I've had people email me and be like, this gave me some insight onto myself, and I really appreciate that. And I mean, obviously the goal is entertainment, but if I can instruct and teach and help and heal all at the same time, why not? Why wouldn't you want to?
For sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, a part of treatment for PTSD is trying to remember a thing and then put a better association with that triggering memory, so not just, I mean, yeah, I sorry, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but I think that it is a thing that can be helpful, so.
They have a treatment now for PTSD involving video games, where they program in a situation similar to whatever it is that caused you PTSD, but you get to have a different outcome.
Yeah.
And that
Oh, nice.
overwrites I mean, it doesn't overwrite your memory, but overwrites the trauma part of it, the part of your memory that is causing you the pain.
Yeah.
And it's reading military sci-fi, for me, the good stuff. I think that's a lot too, that may be part of why when people read military sci-fi and it's not accurate, it feels so wrong to them, because it's almost like uncanny valley, like they went into this believing it was going to be military sci-fi, but it actually ended up being a romance, or it ended up being space opera with a military
Romance between a platoon sergeant and lieutenant.
yeah, right.
It's good.
And all of a sudden it feels so wrong, like you've been lied to. And and kind of getting back to the business of writing, that's how important, that's why it's so important to understand what you're writing and who you're writing for. Because if you're writing for people who want military sci-fi, and you end up writing something that's not military sci-fi, they're going to let you know about it, because they're going to have an emotional, visceral reaction to reading it when they thought it was one thing and ended up being another.
Yeah.
Probably the best advice for that is if you're uh, concerned about doing it right or not, don't label it mil sci-fi. And if you get it right, then the people that know will label it mil sci-fi, and then it'll spread in those circles. But if you get it wrong, then you can just say, it's just regular sci-fi. I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. It's just space opera. It's romance space opera.
Yeah, for sure.
With military people in it.
Right.
Yeah. Kind of gives you an out.
The whole
Number
thing.
of times I've heard somebody want to label their space opera as military sci-fi because military people were in it, and I'm just like, don't do it. And they never
Yeah.
listen to me, and they do it, and they book bombs. There's a reason for it. Because
Right.
the military people come read the book, and they're like, this is not military sci-fi. 1 star.
Yeah,
No matter how good it is.
100%. Right.
Do we know any
All right, I think
stories?
we probably should wrap it up because we're getting close to our.
We are. I was just going to ask if we knew anybody else that. I guess this would be a great one for Jonathan Brazy at some point if we get him on the show.
Oh yeah,
I'd be.
Yeah.
I know he wrote throughout his whole career, and then was able to because he talked about like he had been trying to publish while he was in the military.
Wasn't his first one like Werewolf of Marines or something like that?
Something,
yeah.
yeah.
He had a Marine who was a werewolf. Yeah.
And
Great
then
movie.
When we have
Great
Richard
one,
on,
yeah.
we'll have to ask him about it. Richard has a really good story about the reason he started writing military science fiction. I won't spoil it here because it's a really good story. When we have him on, we should ask him about it because he wrote when he was in the military as well, but he didn't write military science fiction when he was in the military. So it's kind
Was
of
he
Right.
writing something about the Baron von Richthofen or something like that?
yeah, he was writing kind of alt history almost.
Most of my creative experiences I had when I was in the military was running D&D games, so which helped me eventually as a writer. But I was always the company dungeon master, you know. So I always had a game running on the weekends.
No, good times.
All right. Well, thank you very much for hanging out with us. And if you've got other questions you would like us to weigh in on, I don't know. We love to talk about it. This one, this has been a good conversation. This little, I don't know. We'd love to do more.
Not as jovial as
It's more
jovial.
like
I was
it's
gonna
more
say,
like
it's a little more
backstory. It's
a little more
it's good
serious.
backstory.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Other than Rick's puns.
right.
We need more puns from Rick, more dad jokes from Rick so I can steal them for the opening joke.
Rick, you really should wear a Punisher shirt when you come on the show.
Oh, that's bad.
And he's writing it down. He's like, wear a Punisher shirt.
I know.
Get Punisher shirt.
Load up troopers on a hit and jump gate. Military science fiction podcast.